So every year when we've done with our pattern recognition, we've understood what the trends are that we want to talk about this year. We step back and we say, is there a meta theme here which combines all of these together and which gives us an enhanced understanding of what it is that we're looking at here? Last year, we called that the realignment of fundamentals, and we talked about the way in which business, society, citizens, customers, employees were all thinking about business in different ways, and we were beginning to really construct new ways of thinking about business focused on purpose. We had no idea when we wrote that the pandemic was on its way. And what that did is it accelerated the light that was being shone already on the systems that we use to manage business in our lives. And it did that because we had to experiment with the new at incredible speed early in 2020 all over the world. And we did that because we were faced with lots of different interesting challenges, almost all of us spending way more time at home, almost all of us spending lots more time on screens, change in the reciprocal agreements and arrangements between employers and employees about how just to get things done, change in the way in which businesses operate just in order to be able to get products into the hands of customers, shifts in where we put our focus of empathy for people, huge shifts in that. All of those tell us that what we're looking at in 2021 as a vaccine hoves into view and is going to begin to rebalance our lives as a transition point. That's 2021 and probably 2022 as a transition point. And what we'll be doing, we're going to be mapping out new territory, and that is our meta theme for this year. Exactly like explorers, we will be looking at the territory in front of us. It's a blank canvas, and we'll be able to write new things on top of that and draw ourselves new maps. Make no mistake, what next year is all about is mapping out the 21st century, because it begins then. Fjord trend number one this year, we're calling collective displacement. This is all about the way in which we become disconnected from familiar patterns, the way in which we just live our lives in time and in space has shifted dramatically. Because deep down, patterns of work, patterns of learning, patterns of shopping, patterns of play, these are all had to adapt around the new circumstances of 2020. And that's led to four ways in which we're seeing displacement. We're seeing displacement literally by place, the thinning out of cities as people are beginning to say, I don't know whether I can be resilient in a city. I want to move out from city centers. We're seeing that in Asia. We're seeing that in Europe. We're seeing that in the US. It's about displacement of community. Think about the way in which sports fans can't go to stadia anymore, or at least not now. They'll go back, but not now. So displacement of community. The third is displacement of activity. Actually what I do, I might be literally doing in a different place and possibly in a different way as well, like yoga, for example, previously in a studio, now at home. And the fourth is about the displacement of your sense of agency. I feel less able to do things in the way that I was before because the government is actually telling me I can't. Then there's a sort of self-perpetuating displacement as well, where if the cornerstones of some of our lives, like the pharmacy that serves the office blocks, if the office pharmacy closes because fewer workers are in the office block, then fewer workers want to come back to the office block because the pharmacy isn't there. So that's self-perpetuating. Bluntly, the customer you knew is gone and a new customer has arrived in their place. And the challenges here are about things like information gathering. If my old routines are broken, the places where I gathered information have changed dramatically because I'm not walking past those shops in the same way. I'm not seeing people in the same way and understanding their fashion, their hairstyles, etc. So my information gathering has changed. And because of that, the way in which I'm engaging with things have become much more about micro moments rather than necessarily one long stream of consecutive action, which is, you know, a shopping list. Shopping lists are shifting to being micro moments of action. The third one is how do we replicate texture when we've been displaced? And the fourth is how do we create joy through deeper sense of immersion when some of the immersion we previously had has shifted and we're seeing technology beginning to come in with new ways to create immersion. All of this, of course, also doubled down on the way in which ad tracking technology is changing and creating challenges for advertisers to understand exactly where their customers are and what they're thinking. So collective displacement, foundational trend for us this year, because it really describes a completely new world of people doing different things in different places. Do-yourself innovation is the second Fjord trend for 2021. And this is all about human ingenuity in a time of extreme challenge. And that is leading to a rebalancing of the way in which we approach innovation. So what's going on here is a shift from our traditional focus on devices going to people, and actually it's much more about people creating innovation for themselves. We've seen an explosion of entrepreneurship and business creation in many markets across the world. And beyond that, just fantastic stories about people banding together to create solutions for the problems they see in front of them. That's Colombian engineers creating low-cost ventilator solutions, a company in the UK called Hygiene Hook creating new ways to open doors so you don't have to touch them, an Atlanta student finding new ways to get meals to hospital workers. Crises, think Second World War, drive ingenuity. The Second World War created radar, it created computers, it created superglue. What we're seeing right now is at a much sort of more, more grounded level, is we're seeing humans beginning to take this crisis and adapt around its constraints. By, for example, we saw the rapid rise in the use of Zoom, for example, for schools. No one was really doing that before, but we adapted rapidly and used the technology for a new purpose. But that new purpose is also about personal new purpose. That's why we saw the rise of step-by-step videos on YouTube in the middle of the year as people began to think about what are the new habits I want to create here? How can I do things better? And what that means is the adaptation cycle has got a lot faster. We're not so much building our lives around technology, which we've been doing for the last 25 years. We've now got a flip point where we're beginning to build the technology around our lives, which is why we've seen innovative use of, for example, games platforms like Fortnite to do live concerts like Travis Scott did. We're seeing the lines blurred between innovation, creation, creator, and customer. And really what this means, most importantly, is a shift from prescriptive innovation, here it is in a box which I'm going to give to you, the consumer, to suggestive innovation. Here is a platform that you can use where you can actually create for yourself the innovation you want to see in the world around you. And that's important because we've traditionally struggled in large organizations with getting the stamina needed to see innovation right through to the end, possibly by using human ingenuity at the customer and employee level. We don't need to have quite so much stamina to get the finished product out there. What we need to do is get the affordances out there that people can make it for themselves. It's particularly important to think about health in this context because we said back earlier in the year, that every business would be a health business. We're going to see this trend, do-it-yourself innovation, play out in the health sector more than any other single sector as people try to seek ways to innovate around their health, their bodies, their minds, and creating a better future for themselves. Our third Fjord trend for 2021 is SweetTeams are made of this. And this trend is all about the reframing of work and the new balance of reciprocity between employer and employee. So what's going on here is that work has changed significantly in the last year. For a lot of workers, particularly office workers, the peripheral value of going to an office and networking with people, the soft knowledge that you gain, that has been largely lost. The second thing has happened has been a significant shift, largely invisible but real, of costs to the worker. Now, they may have saved some because they might not in some circumstances be commuting, but they're filling that up with having to buy a new desk, a new chair to sit on, new technology to work from home, pay for higher broadband, pay for the heating costs of being at home during that time. The third is stress on space, both in terms of organizational space, how do we use this asset which is empty, but also the family space which work has invaded. And the fourth is the way in which our use of digital has gone up dramatically, but the infrastructure and tools that we're using it with, think all those mute button unmutes which people forget about doing, that infrastructure and tools is so poor. Now, there are three vectors to think about here when you think about, are we going to go back to our place of work or not? It's not about will we or will we not. It's about the percentage of us will go back. And that's going to be affected by the attitude of workers. Roughly 50% are consistently saying, I'm going to spend more time working from home. The attitude of our companies, in many cases, like the CEO of Netflix saying, please come back, we need people back at work, it's a social environment. But in many cases, CFOs will be looking at this and saying, do we really want to bear these costs anymore? And governments who are telling companies in many places, please get your workers back to work because we're worried about city centres being hollowed out. Now, it's easy to imagine this is just about office workers. It's not. This is about all workers whose jobs are remote or could be remote, and those who are reliant on office workers. So what comes next? Well, four big things to think about. One, we'll see new technology for home working beginning to get adopted over the next 2 or 3 years. That's both software and hardware. We'll see a greater focus on culture, the sense of belonging that we create, which is what culture is all about. We know how to do that when we're together. We don't know how to do it when we're apart. And that's going to require a lot of hard work and focus. The third one is talent, the dynamic about, do I have to be in a particular city in order to do this job? There are both upsides and downsides of this for both employers and employees. And the fourth one is about control. If work has invaded my home and the brand of work is going to have to be visible behind me when I work, how do I manage that balance between what I actually own in my home and what the company owns? Fundamentally, we're going to be designing the office from the ground up over the next 2 years and trying to understand the give and get as we prototype new ways of working. Interaction wanderlust is our trend really all about what do we do with all this screen time. Screen time has rocketed up over the last year. And it's helped us to understand something which was there already, which is a degree of sameness we see in what we see. This is about the interaction between design, content, and audience. It's about how do we bring in excitement, joy, serendipity. Three, I would suggest, very, very important words. What's going on? Firstly, the rise of particularly user-generated content, particularly through TikTok, for example, but others as well, is shifting our sense of what are the aesthetics of what we expect to see in content. The second is a lot of design of apps, for example, has become incredibly commoditized over the last few years. Fundamentally, because we've become really fairly good. We know what good looks like, and we're fairly good at delivering that now, particularly in the era of low code, no code. The third is we've lost a lot of that peripheral vision that we take for granted when we're walking around in supermarkets or offices or streets. You lose that when you're spending so much time focused on screens, and we need to find ways to get that back in. The fourth is a growing trend for touchscreens in public spaces has been brought to a juddering halt, and we'll see a shift towards much more touchless and gestural-based transactions going on. So what comes next? Well, the race is on to differentiate, and our money is that the way a lot of people are going to be differentiating is via entertainment. Look at platforms like Discord and the huge growth of 47% in Discord's case of usage. Why? Because it's a place. It's not a social medium. It's actually a place. It's a place to hang out. It's a place where you have fun. It's about a combination between fun, platforms, live, and social. And when you're thinking about that, think about the tiers of engagement. It can't be one size fits all, particularly if you want to make money out of these platforms. What are the tiers of engagement that you introduce? And how do you translate and recreate offline emotion? We're shifting mechanics much more online, but we need to shift emotion much more online as well. Think, for example, in the stadium. And how do you do all of that and make all of that sustainable as well? Because make no mistake, even as we want to intensify our use of screen technology and differentiate with it, we're also increasingly seeing people ask, deep and important questions about how do we decarbonize design? How do we decarbonize our digital interaction? So if everything has been collectively displaced in terms of people, then there's a flip side to that, which is a displacement of the way in which companies do things. And this is why this trend is called liquid infrastructure, because it's a flip side of collective displacement. If you have new demands and new patterns of demand, you have tremendous stresses, and we saw this play out early this year in business models. And where we think this is going is increasingly companies are going to start focusing on not so much efficiency, although they're having to do that hard at the moment, but also how do we use our assets for delight as much as efficiency. So what's going on here? Well, how we get things, literally get our hands on things, products and services, has changed. So how companies ship, store, deliver, that's had to change as well. But also, as we become a bit displaced, our experience expectations have changed. We call these liquid expectations. And we're taking expectations we might have had, for example, in shops, and wanting to see those delivered at the point of delivery when we unbox. All of that has meant that the shift to digital, particularly around infrastructure, has meant cost to serve has gone up dramatically, whether that's cost to serve of online delivery, or whether it's cost to serve because you're running a retailer and you've had to reconfigure your establishment around health and safety. Some companies are experimenting with direct to consumer, and some of that may pay off, but it's difficult to see how that scales, either for the organization or actually for the customer themselves. Fundamentally, this is about rethinking the trade-offs between experience and cost. We can't have all the experience we want. We don't have unlimited ability to absorb cost. So what's next? Well, really, simply, it's rethinking the supply chain, but not only the supply chain, but all physical assets, so space as well, and how to use those physical assets. We'll see a lot more business-to-business sharing. We've seen that with dark stores, with dark restaurants as well. We'll see new business models. There's been dramatic growth in subscriptions over the last year, accelerating what was happening already. We'll see supply chain models beginning to shift and talk about how do we measure for growth and experience as much as we measure for efficiency. And we'll see a lot of experimentation in how do you manage that last 10 feet, something so well worked, something we knew how to do in retail establishments, but we need to get a hell of a lot better at doing it when it comes to the delivery of the, the bland cardboard box into your house. How can we make that a much more inviting experience? However, as we've said, noted on a couple of the other trends, there is a sustainability caveat to this as well. All of this will increasingly be done with something that is more than a footnote on sustainability, but sustainability actually right at the heart of it, of how you rethink the use of the assets. So this is not a trend that can be done just by simply thinking about end user. We also have to think systemically about the effects of supply chain on the planet. Our sixth Fjord trend for 2021 is called the empathy challenge. This trend is really driven by the fact that awareness of inequality went up massively during 2021, partly because of, but actually not entirely because of COVID. And it's forced us to focus on how do we manage the narratives that shape brands. And we believe that at the heart of the empathy challenge is a requirement that we're going to have to spend a lot of time balancing and blending pragmatism and empathy, because we cannot be empathetic to everybody all the time. So what's going on here? 2020, the rise of a focus on inequality, the use of the word privilege. COVID has massively exacerbated all sorts of inequalities. If we just take women, for example, in the US, they're doing 15 hours more household work per week, I'm ashamed to say, than men. But many other inequalities have been exacerbated, but new ones have arrived as well. New kinds of joblessness, or people being newly jobless in careers they didn't expect to be. School closures putting pressure on young parents working from home with children. Young workers not being able to go into work and build their networks. All of this is all about narratives and truth. And social media have put narratives and truth front and center. Culture wars are things that everybody can create, everyone can participate in. Information is easy to access, but also easy to use people to mislead. And really, we have this tremendous problem now about how do you handle the polarities between different ways of thinking about the world. Empathy is a design tool, and we've used and talked about empathy a lot over the last 10 years as design has come front and center in business. But polarities make empathy a lot harder because there is a fierce social media scrutiny on everything that companies do. And the result of that is we really are unable to be empathetic to everyone all the time. You think about the range of inequalities and issues that concern us, whether that's how do care workers manage their work-life balance, mental health, sustainability, Black Lives Matter, gender issues, or the new inequalities I mentioned already, and manage business survival at the same time. The solution, we think, is increasingly companies will have to narrow their focus of empathy and root that in purpose as a guidance system for where they place their empathy. In addition to that, work much harder to bring design and communications together. They can no longer live apart. The message and the detail have to be as one, because that way we deliver empathy as behavior rather than simply a design tool we use to imagine that we're getting closer to our customers. And all of that ladders up to managing stories much, much better than we've done in the past. Companies will devote way more time to narratives and stories, are already doing so, in fact. Our last trend for this year is rituals lost and found. Rituals are so important to humans. They are the framework with which we cope with life. They're emotional. They ground our existence. And many of them have been torn up, challenged by what's happened during the pandemic. Huge opportunities exist here for organizations to help us find what we're craving, which is new ways to connect. Because like I said, rituals are human. They help us deal with loss. They're about routine. They're about sentiment. They can be big, like weddings, and small, decompressing on the train on the way back from work. We've seen a huge rise in spirituality this year. The rise of meditation apps has accelerated hugely. Spirituality all around because people are saying, I need these rituals in my life. But these things are also not only about fixed rituals, they're also about rethinking priorities and values, and lots of evidence people are doing that around the environment, around community, around being local. People are telling us right the way around the world that they expect change in their own personal habits. In the US, 75% of people have tried to live differently and expect to continue to do so. We need to distinguish between habits, that's something you do every day that makes your life easier, and ritual, that's something meaningful. The opportunity space here, the deep one, is with rituals. And we've identified 4 different kinds of ritual to focus on. There's ritual as portal, that's the transition between one state and another. Really interesting opportunity for beauty, cosmetics, skincare companies. There's ritual as belonging, Friday night drinks, Saturday sports, incredibly important for employees. There's rituals as comfort. So Estee Lauder, for example, doing interesting things with playlists and sampling with Spotify. And then there's rituals, this is a really deep, as anchor. That's Diwali, Christmas, Eid. They don't necessarily need to be associated with religion. It could be Thanksgiving, for example. These 4 categories of ritual all offer amazing opportunities for all sorts of organizations, both commercial and public sector, to find ways to help their customers and citizens reconnect. To do so, they'll also have to apply cleverly behavioral design principles. How are people motivated to do this? How equipped are they for this change? And is now the right time? Our view is now is definitely the right time for people to be addressing the issue of rituals in their lives and to find help in creating new ones, which help us create a new future, a new 21st century.
welcome back, Mark. Thank you for this presentation.
Thank you.
So the first question we do have for you is, what motivates Fjord to create these trends each and every year? How long have you been doing this? And what is the impetus to create this kind of media?
We've been doing it for 14 years now. The way in which we do it is to get all of our team together all across the world. It's about 2,000 people now. And in a series of workshops in every studio, get them to identify first as individual and then as teams the trends that they believe are happening at the intersection between humans, business, and technology, which we think will affect the way in which we design and build everything to do with experiences, products, and services over the next 1 to 3 years out. So the sort of time scale is fairly close, and we have now a very well worked and tested methodology, which I guess now we're, 2,000 people is quite big. It sort of starts with, it's sort of a mixture of quant and qual, basically, to pull it together. And then we do a lot of pattern recognition of all the input, because it creates an enormous amount of content in order to understand, where it's going. I know I've answered 2 of the questions you asked, but what was the one you led off on? Because I think I need to come back to that.
Actually, like on this particular set of trends, we were wondering, like, which one you find the most disruptive, the most radical, the one that differentiates Fjord the best from the other agencies creating that kind of media. Like, what is the biggest one with the most impact and that will last the most?
I'm not sure that I can single out one trend which makes us different from anything that anybody else might be saying. I think that interaction wanderlust is going to be very, very big indeed, much bigger than I think we thought when we wrote it. I'm increasingly realizing that we're seeing a shift in digital to place. And what I mean by place is that we are creating virtual spaces, places to which people go. In a real way, Peloton effectively are bringing people a place they go to. I think Zwift, the very popular cycling app, is doing exactly the same thing. I know that from personal experience. It's a imaginary country that I go to. In fact, they have France in it, so it has not just imaginary countries, but real countries as well, where I cycle, and there's no cars, there's no vans, there's just other cyclists. But I also can shop there. I can also meet other people. It's a social medium. It's a health app. It's many things wrapped into one. But if I try to define what it is, it's a place. I think if you look at what's happening with companies like Roblox, who are talking about, their CEO is talking about the creation of what he calls the metaverse. What is he talking about? He's talking about a place where stuff happens. And I think this shift to virtual place is, if I'm honest, probably way bigger than we identified when we first wrote the trends, a while ago. So I would really single out that one. On top of that, there's a shift to live going on as well. And I think Clubhouse is a very good example of that, where we're beginning, probably place and live, if you then put those together, I think a lot of what's going on as a trend is that we're trying to replicate the affordances of the real world in digital, but then we're adding things you can only do in digital to it. So place and live as bedrocks of interaction wanderlust. I think those are the most exciting ones for me right now to think about.
And probably the most complicated to translate into French, to be honest. Like, I have absolutely no idea how to translate that. I'll have to check that out.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. It's great having new words, even in French. Mariam?
Yeah, I have a question about the decarbonized design. So you mentioned it during your presentation. So I was wondering, where should we start in this concept, and maybe more inputs about this or examples?
So what we discovered, we've done a great deal of work on decarbonizing design. Well, let me just ask you, so there's 2 ways of looking at this. Are you talking about designing for decarbonization, which is, if you like, the bigger goal, because that's about the redesign of everything? Or are you talking about decarbonizing design itself and the impact of design, which is important but a narrower set? Which would you like me to talk about, or maybe both?
You are both.
Okay, so let's start with the narrow one.
Okay.
We've done quite a lot of work with a client, and we're beginning to hear other clients ask for similar stuff, which is, how can we lower the carbon impact of the digital media that we use? Now and a lot of this is about, for example, using lower quality, or broadcasting on lower quality. So not, for example, broadcasting high HD when you're streaming to a mobile phone. It's actually unnecessary, and it uses, I think I'm right in saying something like 8 times the amount of carbon and energy in order to get it to a phone than if you do a lower grade output. Now, of course, many clients, many enterprises would say, well, hang on a moment, we don't want our material to be represented in a lower grade medium. But it may just be that we have to accept this, and we have to begin to manage the expectations of consumers around lower grade or lower quality of delivered content, or perhaps I should say a quality of delivered content to the screen, which is appropriate for what we need to do to decarbonize. Now, that's going to require quite a lot of education of both enterprise, but also of end customers as well, to accept that. And it covers, working with this particular client, what they understood very clearly was, they're a large multinational. Every visit to their website burns carbon. Now, they're actually in the energy space, so they have a vested interest in looking at everything that they do and reducing the carbon footprint of everything, even down to, their media. I think this does create a real tension, which is the whole of marketing has been built on get people to consume your content as much and as frequently as possible. And now we're going to have to go into reverse on that somewhat, and not so much push at sheer volume of content, but think about quality of content where it comes to the environment as much as, if you like, the content of the content. And this is going to become a very big thing. I'm hearing this, clients now actively asking questions about it. The second one, which was what I call the broader agenda, which is designing for decarbonization. Again, if you look at the implications of sustainability, it means that we're going to have to think about the redesign of absolutely everything. I almost can't think of anything which doesn't require at least looking at and thinking, is this being delivered in a responsible way? And do we need to think about redesigning it? And I think many things, products and services, will fall into the category, a bit like cars are at the moment, of us thinking, there must be a better way to do this. And I think that covers everything from shoes to cars to furniture to digital services I've just been talking about. As that happens, it opens up this huge world of, well, actually, how do you do that? How do you design to decarbonize? And of course, then you hit the problem that this is a very, very complex space. And what's needed is a grounding in systems design. And we're increasingly leaning on our colleagues who are experts in systems design. I'm not, and I'm certainly not going to pose as that I am, but the systemic systems design approach is critical to this because of the complications that it introduces. But we don't have a choice. And lastly, I'll finish. I'm sorry, I've been quite long-winded on this answer.
No, that's great. Thank you, Mark.
But companies, there's been this idea for the last 10 years that companies would begin to change when they came under consumer pressure to do so. So the consumer pressure is there and it is growing. But actually what we've seen over the last year, even in the last few weeks, is that the pressure companies are coming under from their shareholders, from their employees, from the courts. Look what happened with Shell in Holland, for example. Look what happened with Chevron and Exxon on the same day in the US from their shareholders demanding ESG goals, demanding ESGs. So when you look at those, that level of pressure is actually more important now than the consumer pressure. and where we think a lot of companies are going to go is a realization that they have to educate the consumer to change, not wait for the consumer to pressurize them through their wallet to change.
Great answer, and it definitely, I think, helps knowing that even employees do have a role to play in all of that. We've got a question from one of the viewers, from André, who's asking, what could be the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis on the specifically on the empathy challenge you talked about during the presentation?
I think COVID has focused our attention on where we choose to give empathy. And I mean, right now, for example, in the UK, and I suspect you're having the same debate in France, there's a big debate about, do we vaccinate teenagers and children, or do we send those vaccination doses to third world countries, to developing countries, in order to begin to get the vaccination of the whole world underway? And it's a good debate, and there are good arguments on both sides. So I'm not going to say which is right and which is wrong. But if you think about the debate, it's really, some of the debate is framed about where do we put our empathy and where's the best place to put it. I think that, and I think what we're seeing unbelievably clearly in some research we're releasing next week, actually, called Life Reimagined, is that consumers all over the world, or half of all consumers all over the world, are literally reimagining their personal purpose and their values. And what's happened with the pandemic is it's caused a lot of people, not everybody, let's be clear, but a lot of people, to be hugely reflective because they've had either the time and space to do so, or because they've had the economic necessity to do so because they haven't got a job suddenly. And that reimagination of our lives, which looks like it's happening with at least half the population and maybe more across the world, that's huge because we've been thinking hard. And I think that too is going to mean that this issue about how companies position themselves and what they say about what they do and where they choose to put their empathy is just going to continue to go up the agenda. And it's not an easy problem to resolve.
Thank you for this answer.
Yeah, we have a next question from Jean-Christophe, who is wondering if this health crisis make it greater, the rupture between people who use very well digital tools and who are very
familiar
with digital tools, and the others. Maybe we have more differences in the level of use of digital in our society.
And I guess it brings back to the inequality topic you talked about.
So I think, so I don't think I'm in the best position to give an answer about those who are digitally not empowered. It's not something we've spent a lot of time studying over the last year. I think what is true and is more optimistic is that most people shifted to understand digital better over the last year and a bit. And that's been a very important and clear trend. I mean, if we look, certainly in the UK, it was very difficult to get anything that you needed, some of the basics of life in the early days of the pandemic, unless you went online and got them to come to your home. The consequences of that is that in the UK, and this is pretty staggering, something like 50% of non-grocery retail is now happening through the internet. So that's, I've seen different figures. I've seen both 40 and 50%, but approaching half of all shopping, which is not grocery, is now happening through a screen. And the UK is leading the world in that. I'm not trying to say we're better. We are leading the world. And I think that trend is happening everywhere. So in other words, what I'm really saying is that I think a lot of people have forced themselves, the pandemic has forced people to go digital, and many people are not going back. So yes, there's a gap between those who are digitally enabled and those who are not, but I think that gap is closing.
Okay. Thank you. Laurent is asking, ecological strategies are often restricting massive production and massive consumption, which makes shareholders money. Do you really think that in a liberal world, big companies can have a real ecological policy, sustainable policy? Isn't it a way to be seen as responsible rather than to be actually responsible as a long-term strategy?
So we need to sort of tease apart some of the words in there. When it comes to, I think many people are worried at the moment that all of the emphasis on sustainability is falling on carbon neutral and that agenda. And in many ways, that is the most important agenda, because if we can reverse the growth in CO2 in the atmosphere, then we can at least stand a better chance of reversing the growth or at least halting the growth in global warming, which is the single most dangerous thing that we have to deal with. However, what that does at the same time is it tends to obscure broader ecological questions about ecosystems and the way in which we are destroying those ecosystems. It's a related topic, but it's not actually the same topic. I know that the UK government are incredibly keen that at COP26 in Glasgow in November, the ecosystem narrative is elevated and we begin to try and get the world to focus on that as well. And so I don't think people are blind to this. Trying to answer your question directly, the only way forward, it seems to me, and this is a not quite totally personal point of view, is that we have to begin to reframe. We can't go on consuming more and more and more. We have to begin to consume better. And when we use the word better there, we've got to reframe what we mean by better. I don't mean, a better phone in terms of it works faster. I mean a better phone in terms of it's produced in a better way for the environment. So if this shirt is both lovely quality, but also is recyclable and is produced in a good way, which minimizes water wastage, et cetera, then I'm buying better rather than just buying more. And I think that's the reframing. I don't think we can be certain that more versus better is enough. And at some stage, I think there is going to be a debate about that. But I think where we need to shift now, realistically, and I think this goes to the heart of your question, most big companies, if you tell them you've actually got to encourage your consumers to buy less, the only company I can see doing that are IKEA and Patagonia at the moment, but not many companies are doing that. It's just so countercultural to how capitalist organizations work. I think we have to persuade large organizations to shift to the more versus better argument, and I think they need to educate customers in that as well. That at least is a stepping stone to a place where we're accounting for our externalities in our economics.
And thank you, that was such a great answer. As a last question, we do have time for one last question. So any teaser for Fjord Trends 2022? Something around sustainability maybe? Since it seems that we've discussed it quite a bit.
Yeah, I think there is, if I regretted anything about what we wrote for this year, it's that we didn't sufficiently understand the degree to which sustainability was going to, the sustainability agenda was going to transcend the pandemic and become more and more important. And I think we guessed that it might back late last year. Now, what we're seeing from what our clients are asking us for and from the level of debate is that people have come through the pandemic, not that it's over, but they've come through the pandemic. I told you that they've reevaluated, many of them have reevaluated their personal values. Part of that is that I think collectively, people are taking sustainability way more seriously. And I think we will definitely be talking about that a lot in trends for 2022.
Yeah, I'm eager to hear how it translates to the Fjord trends next year. I guess that's it. Thank you, Mark. It was really, really great having you and sharing your insights with us and with our viewers. Have a nice day.